Welcome to Just Plain Bible Study. In our last session, Peter wrote about being a soldier armed for battle against the temptations of the flesh. He then goes on to write about being a steward or manager of the gifts and blessings that God gives you. Today, Peter returns to the dominant theme in the first letter. In earlier sessions, I have highlighted the baptismal language that shows up, especially in the early chapters. But the issue of suffering is the persistent theme that shows up from start to finish in this first letter of Peter. And it's the likely reason Peter wrote to these Gentile congregations in Asia. Let's look together at our text.
Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, or a thief, or an evildoer, or as a meddler. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if the righteous is scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? Therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good.
Let's pull together the references to suffering we've seen in order to build a picture of what these Christians are experiencing. I'll take them in order as they appear. In chapter 1, verse 7, Peter says that they are being tested by fire. This doesn't mean that they're being burned out of their homes, but probably describes the experience of their suffering. In chapter 2, verse 12, they are falsely accused by people who either don't understand them or conspire against them. Later in that chapter, Peter counsels them to remain submissive to the public authorities so as not to suffer persecution, and he twice mentions the emperor. In chapter 4, verse 4, and in verse 14, they are maligned and insulted by their persecutors. And now in chapter 4, verse 12, Peter returns to the comparison with fire, a fiery trial they are experiencing. They are perhaps not suffering the loss of property or life that other early Christians would experience in coming years. Yet Peter writes in 4 verse 13 that they are sharing in the sufferings of Christ, who was rejected by the authorities, falsely condemned, and ultimately put to death. They are perhaps sliding into that experience of suffering that Jesus had, as Peter himself would experience in just a few years after writing this letter. Let's take a few minutes to visit what we know about Peter's martyrdom, just a few years before he wrote this letter. The Bible doesn't describe Peter's death, but does tell us the place. It's Babylon, where Peter is serving and where he's writing to these Asian Christians, as he mentions in chapter 5, verse 13. Babylon is symbolic language, which the Apostle John also uses in Revelation chapter 17 and 18. In the Old Testament, the Babylonian Empire represented worldly authority that opposed God and his people. In the New Testament, this symbolism continued, but described not actual Babylon, but the city of Rome and the Roman Empire. Early Christian historians record Rome as the place where Peter served and then died. The first to refer to this is Clement, the bishop of Rome, at the end of the 1st century. In the late 2nd century, a defender of the faith named Caius mentions Peter's death while recording a dispute with a false teacher. Dionysius, the bishop of Corinth, also near the end of the 2nd century, writes to the Roman Christians that Peter and Paul were planted together at Rome at the end of their ministry. He's referring to their burials. The Roman Christian Tertullian tells us that Peter was crucified under Nero, the first emperor to persecute the church, and the Alexandrian teacher Origen relates that Peter was crucified upside down. He's citing an earlier report of that situation. The 4th century historian Eusebius pulls much of this information together in his history after the persecutions had ended. So early Christian writers and now modern archaeologists point us to Peter's burial at the Vatican Hill and under St. Peter's Basilica, where there is still a chapel in the catacomb there. In fact, Clement of Alexandria in the 3rd century tells us an even more dramatic story, that Peter saw his wife led away to die, and yet rejoiced that she was going home to her Lord. Peter called out to encourage his wife in that moment of final suffering. Peter and his wife apparently lived out Peter's advice that's here in our letter, to stay firm in the faith to the last and to even rejoice in a time of suffering. In the final verses of chapter 4, Peter changes his tone. He goes from rejoicing in the face of suffering to announcing the coming judgment of God. In doing so, Peter refers to Proverbs chapter 11, verse 31, to describe the severity of the coming judgment. Christians experience fiery trials in this life, and even some have painful deaths. But Proverbs and Peter indicate that the wicked will undergo a far harsher experience in the life to come. Peter would have both of these facts draw us to greater fear, love, and trust in our faithful Creator.